Ever feel like you're wading through a sea of information, just trying to find those nuggets of real insight? Well, today we're diving deep, cutting through the noise, and exploring something pretty fascinating in the world of UX design. We're going to unravel how those quirks in our thinking, those mental shortcuts we all take sometimes, well, they actually play a huge role in how we experience the digital world.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. And whether you're a seasoned UX pro or just someone who, use apps and websites daily, this deep dive is all about giving you a practical understanding of some powerful psychological concepts that are, well, they're kind of baked into every digital interaction we have. We're
Yeah.
talking about cognitive distortions and the impact of narratives.
Right, so we're going beyond just pixels and buttons here. We're getting into the psychology of how we perceive and interact with the digital world.
Exactly. And we'll be drawing from some really insightful material that we've gathered, breaking down these concepts in a way that makes sense, and then showing you how they manifest in the language and frameworks that UX designers use every day.
So it's like a behind the scenes look at why some designs just click and others leave us feeling, well, a little lost or maybe even frustrated.
Exactly. It's about understanding that invisible layer of psychology that shapes our experience.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with those mental quirks you mentioned, those cognitive distortions. I'm guessing most of us aren't walking around using that term in our daily lives.
Right. It's a bit of a mouthful. But in essence, cognitive distortions are these, well, they're patterns of thinking that can sometimes lead us astray, make us see things in a way that might not be entirely accurate or rational. And while UX designers might not be using the clinical term cognitive distortions on a daily basis, they're very much aware of these tendencies in human thinking.
So, how do these distortions show up in the world of UX?
Well, a closely related concept you'll hear a lot about in UX is cognitive biases. These are, you could say, predictable ways our thinking can deviate from being perfectly rational, and they have a huge impact on our choices and how we perceive things, especially online.
Okay, cognitive biases. Got it. Can you give me an example of a specific bias that UX designers need to consider?
Absolutely. Let's talk about confirmation bias. This is our tendency to favor information that confirms what we already believe, those things that align with our existing worldview. And sometimes, maybe even unconsciously, we kind of filter out information that contradicts those beliefs.
So it's like we're selectively paying attention to things that reinforce our existing opinions. How does that play out in UX design?
Imagine someone who's been using, let's say, a music streaming app for years. They've got their routines, their way of navigating the app, and their mental model of how it all works. Now, if the app gets a big update and introduces a completely new way to create a playlist, let's say, this user, because of confirmation bias, might totally miss that new feature.
Because it doesn't fit their established way of thinking about the app. It's like their brain just glosses over it.
Precisely. It doesn't align with their ingrained mental model of how the app should function, so they just don't see it, even if it's a great improvement. This aligns with the psychological idea of mental filtering, where, someone might only focus on the negative aspects of something and completely filter out any of the positives.
Right.
It's almost like those positive aspects become invisible to them.
That's a great example. So UX designers need to be aware of this confirmation bias in design in a way that accommodates those ingrained mental models that users bring with them. What's another bias that they need to keep in mind?
Another big one is anchoring bias. And this one is all about the power of first impressions. Essentially, it means that the first piece of information we encounter, the anchor, can have a disproportionate influence on our subsequent judgments and decisions, even if that initial information isn't necessarily the most accurate or relevant in the long run.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that. Like when you see a ridiculously high price for something and then they show you a big discount, you get excited about the deal, even if the discounted price is still pretty steep.
That's exactly how anchoring bias works in the world of e-commerce, for instance. If an online store initially presents a very high price for a product, and then, even if they immediately offer a significant discount, your perception of that product's value has already been shaped, maybe even skewed, by that initial anchor price. UX designers, especially those working on e-commerce sites, are very aware of this.
So they need to be very deliberate about the order in which they present information, especially when it comes to pricing. That first number can really set the stage, even if it's later adjusted.
Yeah, the anchor is powerful. Another tactic that leverages anchoring bias is the common practice of displaying the original, often inflated price crossed out next to the discounted price. This makes that current offer seem much more appealing because it's anchored against that higher price, even if very few people ever actually paid that original price.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about cognitive biases. Now, you also mentioned mental models earlier. How do those fit into the picture?
Mental models are essential to how we understand and interact with the world, both physical and digital. They're essentially the internal representations we have in our minds of how things work. Like, if you think about how a bicycle works or how to use a coffee maker, you're drawing on your mental model of that object or system. And crucially, when it comes to UX, we have mental models for how websites and apps should function.
Right, so it's our internal blueprint for how we expect things to behave online. And I'm guessing these mental models can sometimes be inaccurate or incomplete.
Absolutely. And that's where things can get a bit tricky. One common reason for these inaccuracies is overgeneralization. This is where we take a limited experience, maybe even just a single negative experience, and then apply it broadly as a rule, even when it's not accurate.
Okay, give me a UX example of how that might happen.
Let's say a user clicks on a button on a website, and it doesn't do anything, or it doesn't give them clear feedback that it's been clicked. They might then assume that all buttons on that site, or even all buttons that look similar across the web, are also broken or non-functional. They're overgeneralizing from that one experience.
So they're essentially taking one data point and creating a whole rule based on it. And I'm guessing this can lead to all sorts of usability problems.
Exactly. It can make people hesitant to interact with elements, or it can lead them down the wrong path altogether. And this is where good UX design is so important. Designers aim to create interfaces that align with users' existing mental models, or gently guide them to form new, accurate ones.
So it's about making things predictable and consistent so the design matches what users already expect based on their past experiences online. And I'm guessing clear visual cues are essential here.
Absolutely. If the design doesn't provide clear visual cues, what we call affordances, that a button is clickable or that an element is interactive, those overgeneralizations are much more likely to happen. It's like the design isn't speaking the user's language.
Right, it needs to be intuitive and guide the user. You also mentioned cognitive load earlier. Isn't that about how much mental effort we have to put into using something?
Yes, exactly. Cognitive load refers to the amount of mental processing power we need to use to understand and interact with something. And while cognitive load isn't, strictly speaking, a cognitive distortion itself, a high cognitive load can definitely exacerbate those distortions, those irrational ways of thinking.
How so?
Well, when we're feeling overwhelmed by too much information, too many choices, or a complex interface, our brains kind of go into overdrive. We're more likely to make mistakes, misinterpret things, and even jump to conclusions based more on our emotions than on logic. That's what psychologists call emotional reasoning.
So it's like when you get frustrated with a complicated online form and you just want to give up, even if filling it out is technically achievable, you've just reached your cognitive load limit.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head. That frustration, that sense of this is impossible, is often driven by high cognitive load triggering that emotional reasoning. And UX designers are very aware of this. They work hard to minimize cognitive load, to make things as easy and intuitive as possible.
So instead of bombarding users with a wall of text or a complex form, they might break things down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Exactly. Or they might use clear progress indicators so you know where you are in a process and how much more you need to do. It's all about preventing that feeling of being overwhelmed, which can lead to those distorted negative thoughts.
Right, so less is often more in good UX design. Okay, we've covered cognitive biases, mental models, and cognitive load. Now let's talk about heuristics. I tend to think of those as like rules of thumb for good usability. How do they connect to these cognitive distortions?
They're very much connected. Think of usability heuristics as these guidelines that help us design interfaces that are intuitive, easy to use, and forgiving of user errors. And in doing so, they indirectly address those potential cognitive distortions.
Can you give me a concrete example?
Sure. One of Jacob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics is error prevention. This principle encourages designers to anticipate potential user errors and design systems that prevent those errors from happening in the first place, or at least make them easy to recover from.
Like if I'm typing in my phone number on a website and the form automatically formats it as I type so I don't accidentally enter it incorrectly.
That's a great example. Or if I do make a mistake, maybe I enter the wrong date format, a good system will give me a clear, helpful error message that explains the correct format and maybe even provides an example. This not only helps me correct the mistake, but also prevents me from feeling like I've broken something.
Right, because that feeling of, oh no, I broke it, could be a manifestation of a cognitive distortion like personalization. That's when we incorrectly attribute problems to ourselves, even when they're caused by external factors.
Exactly. So by providing clear, helpful feedback and guidance, designers can prevent users from jumping to those distorted conclusions, those negative thought that might make them abandon the task altogether.
It's like the design is saying, hey, it's okay, we got you. Here's how to fix this.
Precisely. And that's a key aspect of good UX, creating that sense of trust and support, anticipating where users might stumble, and guiding them gently back on track. So to summarize this whole cognitive distortion piece, even though UX professionals might not be using the clinical psychology terms on a daily basis, they're very much grappling with the practical implications of these thinking patterns and how they design interfaces.
They're focused on creating seamless experiences, reducing friction, and addressing those misaligned expectations that often stem from those mismatches between a user's mental model and the way the system actually works.
Exactly. They want users to feel confident, empowered, and in control, rather than confused, frustrated, or blocked. And that's where understanding those cognitive distortions is absolutely essential.
Okay, so we've delved into the sometimes irrational world of cognitive distortions. Now let's shift gears and explore the equally powerful realm of narratives in UX.
Ah, narratives. This is where the power of storytelling really comes into play in UX. And here, the language used in UX is often much more explicit. You'll hear designers talking about storytelling, user journeys, and personas all the time.
Right, because as humans, we're wired for stories. We connect with them on a deep level. But how does that translate into designing a website or an app? I mean, it's not like we're writing a novel here.
Well, it's not about writing a full-blown novel, but it is about creating a cohesive and engaging narrative through the interface, a narrative that guides the user both logically and emotionally through their experience.
Give me a concrete example.
Think about the onboarding process when you first sign up for a new app. A well-designed onboarding experience often tells a mini story. Maybe it's a story of empowerment, like start your journey to better fitness with us, or a story of achievement, like unlock your financial potential.
Right, so it's not just a dry list of features. It's a way of framing the experience, giving users a reason to invest their time and energy.
Exactly. It's about creating that sense of purpose and motivation, that feeling of being on a journey with the app as your guide. And then we have user journey maps, which take this narrative concept to a whole other level.
User journey maps, yeah. I've heard of those. They're like visual representations of the user's experience, right?
Yes, precisely. They map out the entire narrative of a user's interaction with a product or service, from their initial awareness of a need or problem all the way through to achieving their goal and even beyond.
So it's like a step-by-step breakdown of everything the user does, thinks, and feels as they interact with the product.
Exactly. And it includes all the touch points, all the interactions they have along the way. But it's not just a neutral documentation of their actions. It's about understanding their motivations, their emotions at each stage, and their overall goals.
So it's really getting inside the user's head, understanding their story.
Precisely. And crucially, it's about identifying those points in the journey where the user might experience friction, confusion, or even frustration. Like, for example, a user journey map might reveal that people often get stuck at a particular point in the checkout process, maybe because the payment options aren't clear enough.
Right, so the map helps pinpoint those potential pain points, those moments where the user's story might take a negative turn.
Exactly. And then the design team can use that insight to proactively address those issues, maybe by simplifying the payment options or providing clearer instructions. It's like they're rewriting that part of the user's story to make it smoother and more successful.
That's really interesting. So they're not just passively documenting the user's journey, they're actively trying to shape it into a positive and effective experience. Now, what about personas? How do they fit into this narrative approach?
Personas are those fictional characters that designers create to represent the different types of users who might interact with their product or service. Each persona has a name, a backstory, a set of goals and motivations, even a picture to make them feel more real.
So it's like creating a cast of characters for the user experience.
Exactly. And the point of personas is to really get into the heads of these different user groups, to understand their unique needs and perspectives, and importantly, their individual narratives. Like one persona might be the tech-savvy millennial who's always on the go, while another might be an older adult who's less comfortable with technology and prefers a simpler, more guided approach.
Right, so by creating these detailed personas with the unique backstories and motivations, designers can better anticipate how different types of users might approach their product and what kind of narrative they're looking for.
Precisely. And those narratives, those personal stories that the personas represent, can have a big impact on the design decisions that are made. Like if you have a persona who represents a busy parent who's always short on time and easily overwhelmed by complex interfaces, well, that might lead the design team to prioritize simplicity and clarity above all else, maybe even stripping away some features to make the experience as streamlined as possible for that user group.
So the persona's narrative helps the designers empathize with that specific type of user and anticipate their potential frustrations or challenges.
Exactly. It's about designing with a deep understanding of the user's context and their personal story. And it's not just about those big picture narratives like user journeys and personas. Even the small bits of text we encounter in an interface, what we call microcopy, and the overall voice and tone of the product contribute to that overall narrative.
Oh, yeah, microcopy. Those are like the little messages and instructions you see throughout an app or website, right? Like your password must be at least 8 characters long, or congratulations, you've completed level 1.
Exactly. And those little bits of text, even though they might seem insignificant, can have a surprisingly big impact on the user experience. A well-crafted piece of microcopy can encourage a user to keep going when they're feeling stuck, or it can reassure them that they're on the right track. It's like a little pep talk from the app.
Right. Or it can inject a bit of humor or personality into an otherwise dry interaction.
Precisely. And that's where the brand's voice comes in. Whether it's playful, serious, or consistently supportive, that voice contributes to the overarching story the product is telling about itself and its relationship with the user. Like think about Duolingo, the language learning app. They have a very distinct voice,
Yeah.
kind of playful and encouraging, and they even use a bit of gentle guilt tripping sometimes to motivate users. Like, don't let the owl down.
Oh, yeah, I get those messages from the Duolingo owl all the time. It definitely adds a unique flavor to the experience.
Exactly. It creates a narrative of gamified learning where you feel like you're part of a community and you have this little owl character cheering you on, or maybe giving you a slightly judgmental look if you haven't practiced in a while. And then taking this idea of narratives even further, we have this concept of experience narratives.
Experience narratives, that sounds interesting. How is that different from the other types of narratives we've discussed?
Well, experience narratives, sometimes referred to as narrative design, focus on the really big picture. They're about the overarching story that a product tells and, importantly, how that story fits into the user's broader life narrative, their goals, their aspirations, their sense of self. It's about creating meaning and connection that goes beyond just the functional aspects of the product.
Give me an example.
A great example is a budgeting app. Now, on a purely functional level, a budgeting app helps you track your income and expenses. But a well-designed budgeting app might craft a narrative around taking control of your finances, achieving your financial goals, and ultimately living a more fulfilling life.
So it's not just about crunching numbers, it's about empowering users to write their own financial success story.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly motivating. It transforms the app from a simple tool into a partner in their journey towards financial well-being. It taps into their desire for agency and a better future.
I love that. It's like the app is saying, we're in this together, let's write your financial success story. Okay, so we've looked at cognitive distortions, those quirks in our thinking, and narratives, the power of story in UX, somewhat separately. But how do these two fundamental aspects actually interact in the real world of design?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. There are a number of UX approaches that explicitly acknowledge and leverage the interplay between cognitive distortions and narratives. For example, there's behavioral design. This approach draws on our understanding of cognitive biases, those predictable ways our thinking can go astray, and then combines that with storytelling techniques to nudge users toward positive behaviors and desired outcomes.
So it's like using the power of narrative to counteract our natural biases.
Exactly. Like a fitness tracking app might use visual progress bars, rewards, and encouraging messages to motivate users to stick to their fitness goals. They're anticipating our natural tendency towards procrastination or loss aversion, and then using a positive narrative of progress and achievement to keep us engaged.
That makes sense. Then there's empathy-driven design, which, if I remember correctly, is all about really understanding the user's perspective and their needs.
Yes, and empathy-driven design goes hand in hand with the use of narratives, especially through personas and user journey maps. By deeply understanding those user narratives, designers can anticipate potential cognitive biases or emotional roadblocks that might arise.
Like, if they know that a certain user group tends to overgeneralize based on past negative experiences, they can design the interface to be extra clear and reassuring.
Exactly. It's about preemptively addressing those potential distortions by designing with empathy and a deep understanding of the user's mental and emotional state. And then overarching all of this is the philosophy of user-centered design, which really puts the user at the heart of the entire design process.
Right. So it's not about designing for some abstract ideal user. It's about designing for real people with all their quirks, biases, and emotional needs.
Precisely. And within that user-centered approach, both understanding cognitive distortions and crafting compelling narratives are absolutely essential. Cognitive distortions are seen as potential usability problems that need to be solved through careful design decisions, while narratives are seen as powerful tools for connecting with users, motivating them, and guiding them through their experience.
It's like UX designers are almost like psychologists in a way, studying how people think and feel and then using that knowledge to create digital experiences that are not only functional but also emotionally resonant.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how this all plays out in the language that UX professionals use.
Hmm.
Instead of saying, oh, the user is experiencing overgeneralization, they might say something like, users seem to be assuming that this new feature works the same way as that old buggy one, and then focus on designing clearer distinctions and feedback mechanisms.
Right, so they're taking those psychological concepts and translating them into practical design solutions.
Exactly. And similarly, instead of just talking about features in a dry, technical way, they're always thinking about user journeys, stories, and the emotional impact of the experience. It's a much more human-centered way of approaching design.
I love that. So even though the specific jargon might differ, the underlying principles of psychology are deeply embedded in UX design.
Absolutely. And hopefully, our listeners now have a deeper appreciation for the complexity and nuance of designing for humans.
Yes, it's not just about making things pretty or trendy. It's about understanding how our minds work, how we connect with stories, and how those insights can be used to create truly intuitive, enjoyable, and effective digital experiences.
Exactly. It's about designing with empathy, awareness, and a deep respect for the user.
Well said. Now, for a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Think about an app or a website that you use regularly, one that you either find incredibly intuitive and enjoyable, or one that just drives you crazy with frustration. And consider what we've talked about today. Could some underlying cognitive bias be contributing to your frustration in that latter case? Or how does the carefully crafted narrative of that intuitive app contribute to your positive experience? Maybe you'll start to notice those subtle psychological influences at play in the digital world around you.
It's amazing how much is going on beneath the surface of those seemingly simple interfaces. And hopefully now our listeners have a new lens through which to view their digital interactions.
A deeper understanding of the why behind the design.
Exactly.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. It was great to be here.